While everyone laughed and danced beneath the crystal chandeliers at Moscow's grandest gala, one man sat crying alone at an empty table. His name was Viktor Petrov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, a billionaire, respected, feared, yet none of it mattered that night. 5 years earlier he had lost his daughter in a tragic accident, and no fortune had ever been able to fill the silence she left behind. Among champagne glasses and thunderous applause, Viktor was nothing more than a grieving father. Guests avoided his gaze, pretending not to notice his tears. To them, Petrov was still an untouchable figure, almost mythical, but behind the mask, he was a shattered man. His daughter's laughter still echoed in his mind like a ghost refusing to leave. Every note from the orchestra, every burst of laughter in the ballroom only deepened the hollow ache in his chest. How can a man have everything and yet feel he has nothing at all? That night, however, something unexpected was about to happen. A small gesture, from the least likely of places, would forever change this man's destiny. Do you believe in encounters that should never happen, in words so simple they pierce through grief like a beam of light? If you do, stay with me until the end of this story, because what you are about to hear may break your heart, but it might also remind you that sometimes a single word is enough to turn pain into hope. Victor's memories had a way of clawing back to life whenever his tear-filled eyes drifted into the void. The golden ballroom around him faded, and in its place appeared the warm living room of his country house, where Anya, just 6 years old, ran barefoot across the carpet in a blue dress embroidered with tiny flowers. He could hear her laughter again, so pure and bright it seemed to dissolve any shadow lurking nearby. It was a kind of laughter that needed no translation, understood everywhere in the world as the sound of happiness. Victor saw himself kneeling on the floor, hiding behind the armchair as they played hide-and-seek, and when Anya finally found him, she would leap into his arms with blind trust, making him forget about business, contracts, or obligations. In those fleeting moments, he was only a father, and that was enough. He might have owned banks, airlines, and mines, but the greatest treasure of his life was a little girl barely over a meter tall, with golden hair and eyes that seemed to reflect the entire universe. He remembered the freezing Moscow mornings when he insisted on driving her to school himself. Her chauffeur could have done it, but Victor cherished the small hand in a wool glove he got to hold, the walk beside her, the endless stream of questions only a child could ask. "Papa, why do the trees sleep in the winter?" Or, "Do the stars get cold too?" Simple, silly questions, but they disarmed a man who spent his days in multi-million-dollar negotiations and ruthless business strategies. In the car, Anya always asked to turn on old Russian songs, the ones Victor had listened to in his youth. He sang off-key, but to him, it was like listening to an angel reinventing music itself. That was where life's meaning hid, in the small, unremarkable details, and it was those very details that tormented him now. He even remembered the trivial arguments. Sometimes Anya wanted to play before finishing her homework. Victor, pretending to be stern, would tell her no, but all it took was one pleading glance, one hug, and he gave in. He was weak when it came to her, always had been. Until the day life ripped that weakness away from him. The accident was quick, brutal, unforgivable. A car out of control, one moment of carelessness, and the light of his world was extinguished. He hadn't been able to say goodbye, hadn't protected her. All the wealth accumulated over years of relentless victories meant nothing in that instant. From then on, living became just enduring. Breathing was mechanical, smiling an almost unbearable act. At public events he wore the mask of the magnate, but deep down Victor was a castaway, clinging to the memory of his daughter. It was in this hollow state that Sophia appeared that night, like an improbable thread woven by fate. As the orchestra played a Russian waltz, and elegant ladies twirled in their gowns, a little girl of no more than 8 slipped away from the caretakers of the orphanage, invited to the gala. Her dress was far too simple for such a grand hall, her shoes worn, her hair pulled back unevenly. Yet there was an undeniable dignity in the way she carried herself, as though she did not fear being out of place. Sophia walked with small but determined steps, crossing the glittering sea of gold and silver. Some guests glanced at her with disdain, others with indifference. After all, who cared about a stray orphan wandering among millionaires? But she seemed guided by an invisible force, one that drew her straight to Victor's lonely table. He didn't notice her at first. He was lost in his memories, staring blankly at the untouched glass of wine before him. Then suddenly he felt a presence by his side. When he looked up, he met a pair of clear eyes staring directly at him, unflinching. The contrast was so strong that Victor froze. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw Anya's reflection in that gaze. The little girl studied him with a blend of curiosity and compassion, as if she could see through all the layers of grief he had built around himself. "Why are you sad?" Sophia asked, her voice soft yet firm. The simple question hit Victor like a blow. How many people had dared to ask him that in the last 5 years? None. Everyone knew of his tragedy, but no one ever touched the wound. Yet this child, a stranger, had done so without hesitation. He could not respond. Silence stretched between them, heavy but strangely tender, until Sophia added quietly, "Know what it feels like to lose." Her words echoed like a muffled thunder in Victor's heart. He lifted his gaze again, searching her small face. The flushed cheeks, the uneven fringe, the dress that screamed of neglect. Everything about her spoke of abandonment, but in her eyes there was a flame of resilience, hope. Victor had no idea how to react. His instincts, sharpened by decades of controlling boardrooms and commanding respect, failed him. There was no negotiation tactic, no calculation that could explain what this girl had just stirred inside him. He leaned closer, placing her small hands on the edge of his table. The boldness of the gesture clashed with her delicate frame. "Sometimes I think my parents left because someone very important needed them," she said. "But when I see you sitting here all alone, it feels like you lost someone important too. Is that true?" Victor swallowed hard. He felt exposed in a way he hadn't experienced, even in his most private confessions. A child, in the middle of a crowded ballroom, was stripping him of his defenses with startling ease. Guests whispered in the background, unsettled by the scene. The caretakers had noticed Sophia's absence and hurried across the hall to retrieve her. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. Victor saw only her, fragile yet unafraid. He forced himself to speak, his voice cracking like a rusty hinge. "Yes, I lost someone who was everything to me." Sophia did not flinch, did not look away. Instead, her gaze softened, as though she understood more than her years should allow. Then came something he could never have predicted. Sophia extended her tiny hand, and, with the uncalculated sincerity only children possess, touched his arm. "I understand," he whispered. So simple, so devastating. The words pierced through him, awakening emotions he thought long buried. In that touch was a genuine empathy, a silent bridge between two solitudes. The murmur of the crowd grew louder, the caretakers nearly at their side, but for Victor the world had shrunk to this improbable encounter. A part of him long locked away began to stir again. It wasn't healing yet, but it was a crack in the armor he had built to shield himself from life. For the first time in years, Victor no longer felt entirely alone. And there, in the midst of Russia's most luxurious gala, surrounded by gold, music, and indifference, a broken man and an orphan girl began a story that would change them both forever. A story born from silent tears and an innocent question, but one that would soon reveal much more than anyone could imagine. Victor sat frozen, the touch of the little girl's hand still lingering on his arm, as though it carried the warmth of something he had long forgotten. Her words, so plain, so unguarded, echoed in his mind. "I understand." For years he had been surrounded by people who avoided his pain, people who pretended the wound did not exist. And here, a child he had never seen before had dared to touch it directly. He should have pushed her away, should have told her to return to her caretakers, but his body betrayed him. He wanted to know more about this girl who stood before him with such innocence and such strength. "What is your name?" Victor asked at last, his voice hushed. "Sophia," she replied, her lips curving into the faintest smile, though her eyes remained solemn. "And you are Papa, aren't you?" The word landed like a lightning strike. Papa. No one had called him that since the night Anya died. For a moment, Victor could not breathe. His chest tightened, the world blurred, and his throat burned with unspoken cries. "No," he managed to whisper. I was a papa once, but not anymore." Sophia tilted her head as though weighing his words. Then, with a simple honesty that disarmed him, she said, "Once a papa, always a papa, you don't forget how." The caretakers arrived then, hurrying to take her hand, but Victor lifted his palm subtly to stop them. He could not explain why, but he needed her to stay, even just for a moment longer. "She's not disturbing me," he said sharply, and the authority in his tone silenced their protests. The caretakers backed away hesitantly, leaving Sophia standing before him once more. There was a pause, and then Victor, compelled by something beyond reason, spoke again. "I had a daughter once. Her name was Anya." He surprised himself by saying it aloud. He rarely spoke her name anymore. It was too sacred, too painful. But in front of Sophia, the syllables fell like a confession he had been longing to make. "What happened?" Sophia asked softly, her little voice trembling. not from fear, but from compassion. Victor's gaze lowered, his vision unfocused. The music of the ballroom receded, replaced by the memory of screeching tires and the ringing silence that followed. He could not speak of the accident. He could only force out, "She went away, and she never came back." Sophia nodded slowly, as if she understood more than the words themselves. "I know what that feels like," she said. "I lost my mama and papa. They went away too. People say they're in heaven, but sometimes heaven feels very far away." The words cut through Victor's defenses. This child, this orphan, was carrying the same unbearable emptiness he had lived with. He was not pitying him, not trying to console him with hollow platitudes. He was sharing her own wound, placing it alongside his. Then, with a suddenness that startled him, Sophia asked, "Would you dance with me?" Victor blinked, sure he had misheard. "Dance?" "Yes," he said simply, as though it were the most natural request in the world. "You look so sad. Maybe dancing will make you smile again. That's what my papa used to do with me. He said dancing makes the heart lighter." Victor's instinct was to refuse. How could he dance here, in front of everyone, with a child he had only just met? The thought seemed absurd. Yet when he looked into her eyes, he saw not mischief, not pity, but a quiet determination. He wanted to give him something, and against his own logic, Victor rose from his chair. The murmurs around the ballroom grew louder. Guests turned to stare as the billionaire, the man known for his coldness and pride, took the hand of a little orphan girl. Some whispered in shock, others frowned, but Victor no longer cared. The orchestra's melody swelled, and awkwardly at first he began to move with her. Sophia rested her small hand on his, her other hand on his chest, mimicking the grace of dancers far older than her years. And then, without meaning to, without realizing the power of her words, she looked up at him and whispered, "Papa." The single word shattered him. His steps faltered, his throat tightened, and tears flooded his eyes before he could stop them. For 5 years he had dreaded hearing that word again, certain it would destroy him. Yet now, from the lips of this little girl, it felt like life itself had been breathed back into him. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Guests who had mocked him for his loneliness now watched in disbelief as Viktor Petrov, the untouchable billionaire, wept openly in the arms of a child. And Sophia, oblivious to the spectacle, only held him tighter, as if reminding him that no one, no matter how powerful, should have to carry grief alone. For Victor, the moment was unbearable and miraculous all at once. The weight of loss pressed down on him, but beneath it flickered something he had thought extinguished forever, the fragile spark of hope. Victor's body trembled as the orchestra swelled around them. He had not danced since the night of Anya's last birthday, when she had begged him to twirl her in the living room, despite the absence of music. That night, he had lifted her onto his shoes so she could sway with him, her tiny arms around his neck, her giggles echoing through the house. Now, years later, with Sophia pressed gently against his chest, it was as though time had folded in on itself. The weight of grief and the lightness of memory collided, leaving him suspended between the past and the present. Every step was hesitant. His feet, once steady in boardrooms and negotiations worth billions, felt clumsy here, but Sophia seemed unbothered. He hummed softly to the melody, her small head resting just beneath his chin, and for the briefest moment, Victor felt himself breathe differently, as if air had returned to lungs that had long been constricted. Around them, the gala transformed. The chandeliers still glittered, the gowns still swayed, but whispers rippled through the room like a tide. Some guests smirked, amused at the spectacle of the almighty Viktor Petrov, reduced to tears by a child. Others shifted uncomfortably, unable to reconcile the image of power with the reality of raw vulnerability before them. And yet a few, just a few, felt their own throats tighten as they witnessed something they could not name but instinctively understood. Victor, however, heard none of it. He was inside the fragile cocoon created by Sophia's presence. Her calling him Papa had not broken him as he feared. It had cracked open a door sealed by despair. He could almost hear Anya's laughter weaving through Sophia's voice, almost see his daughter's golden hair, where Sophia's dark strands now fell. The illusion was painful, but it was also intoxicating. For the first time in 5 years, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like not to live in silence anymore. Sophia looked up at him, her wide eyes shimmering with a wisdom far older than her years. "See," she whispered, "dancing makes the heart lighter." Victor tried to answer, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he tightened his hold on her, afraid she might slip away if he loosened his grip even slightly. The orchestra shifted to a slower tempo, the violins drawing out notes that seemed to mirror his trembling heart. And as they moved in unison, Victor realized how profoundly this child, this stranger, had disarmed him. He thought of the other children in the orphanage. Their faces he had seen only in reports when he agreed to fund its programs in Anya's memory. They had been statistics, numbers in a ledger of philanthropy meant to quiet the guilt gnawing at him. But now, holding Sophia, he understood something he had long resisted. Each of those children carried a story, a wound, a longing not so different from his own. And somehow, fate had chosen Sophia to pierce his armor. When the song ended, silence seemed to hang heavier than applause. The guests hesitated, unsure whether to clap or to gossip. Victor released Sophia gently, and for a moment he thought she might simply curtsy and be led away by the caretakers. But she lingered, staring at him as though she had more to say. "You miss her very much, don't you?" she asked quietly. The question stole the breath from his lungs. He nodded, unable to speak. "I miss mine too," she continued. "But maybe if we miss them together, it won't hurt so much." Victor's chest heaved, and for the first time in years, he let out a sob, unrestrained, raw, and aching. It was not the controlled grief he allowed himself behind closed doors. It was the full weight of a man broken, echoing across a ballroom that had never seen him falter. He covered his face with one hand, ashamed, but Sophia placed her palm against his arm again, steadying him with a child's courage. The caretakers approached once more, gentler this time, recognizing that something sacred had occurred. They tried to coax Sophia away, but she turned to Victor before leaving. "Don't be alone anymore, Papa," she said, the words slipping out again with effortless affection. Victor froze as the caretakers led her away. The room around him blurred into meaningless shapes and colors. Only her voice remained, echoing in his mind, circling the cavern of his heart. Papa, not as a reminder of what he lost, but as a glimpse of what he might still become. When he finally returned to his seat, Victor no longer saw the untouched wine or the ornate decorations. He saw the path his grief had carved, the emptiness he had chosen to inhabit, and the faint glimmer of something beyond it. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew one thing. The night had not ended with despair. It had begun with it. And now, something else, something unexplainable, was growing in its place. Victor had thought the moment could not cut any deeper than it already had, but he was wrong. As the orchestra carried them through the ballroom, Sophia's small voice rose again, almost casual, almost instinctive, as if the word had lived on her tongue long before she met him. "Papa." It slipped out like a sigh, like a truth too natural to be censored. For her it was an innocent slip, perhaps a comfort she had once known and lost. For him it was an earthquake. The sound of it cracked through his chest, sending shards of grief and memory scattering in every direction. His feet faltered, his body stiffened, and for a terrible second he thought he might collapse right there in front of all the guests, crushed by a word of just 2 syllables. The ballroom seemed to freeze around him. Conversations halted mid-whisper. Laughter faded into silence, and even the violins drew their bows more softly, as if sensing the seismic shift in the air. Victor's face drained of color, his eyes wide, his lips trembling with the weight of all he could not say. The last time he had heard that word had been from Anya, her tiny voice calling him from her bedroom down the hall, asking for one more bedtime story. It was the sound that had shaped his very identity, and since the night she died, it had become a word exiled from his world, too painful to hear, too sacred to risk cheapening. Now, a stranger had given it back to him, and the result was unbearable and intoxicating all at once. Inside him, memories cascaded like a flood. He saw Anya on a snowy morning, her mittened hand waving as she shouted "Papa" before running into school. He saw her in the summer, chasing butterflies in the garden, calling "Papa, come see," with the urgency of discovery. He even saw her at her last birthday, insisting he lift her high above the crowd of relatives, so she could announce proudly, "This is my Papa." Each memory tore at his heart, but each also glowed with the unbearable beauty of what he had once had. And here was Sophia, conjuring it all back with a single word she had not even meant to wound him with. Victor's instinct was to retreat, to pull away, to protect himself. His hand loosened from hers, his eyes darted toward the ground, his chest rising and falling with erratic breaths. But then he looked at her face, earnest, fragile, untainted by calculation, and he realized there was no malice in it. He had not meant to tear open the scar. He had simply spoken what she felt, filling the empty space in her own heart with the word that had once anchored her world. In that realization, something shifted. For years, Victor had built a fortress of silence around the word Papa, but perhaps it was not a prison. Perhaps it was a door waiting for the right hand to push it open. The orchestra slowed, the song winding to a delicate close. Sophia smiled up at him, unaware of the storm raging inside his chest. The audience, sensing the end of the dance, broke into hesitant applause. Some clapped politely, others with the nervous enthusiasm of those who do not quite understand what they are witnessing, but feel compelled to respond. Victor barely heard it. His eyes stayed locked on Sophia as he led her gently back to the edge of the dance floor, his steps stiff, his mind in chaos. A caretaker approached quickly, bowing apologetically. "Mr. Petrov, forgive us. She should not have—" But Victor raised a hand, silencing the woman with a simple gesture. His voice was steady now, though inside he still shook. "She is not disturbing me." The caretaker nodded nervously, tugging Sophia's arm to lead her back to the group of orphans seated at the far end of the hall. As they moved away, Victor's gaze followed, tracing the line of her small frame until she disappeared behind a cluster of gilded chairs. The applause faded, conversation resumed, and the Gala's glittering facade creaked back into place. But Victor was no longer the same man who had sat weeping alone at the table. Something had been undone. Something had been set in motion. Later that night, as the Gala drew to its conclusion, Victor remained in his seat long after most of the guests had left. He could not shake the image of Sophia's eyes, nor the sound of her calling him by the name he thought buried. When the director of the orphanage approached him to thank him for his generous sponsorship, Victor listened only half-heartedly, until a phrase cut through his fog. "We are forever grateful for your continued support in Anya's name, Mr. Petrov. The children at the Petrov Memorial Orphanage truly owe you their futures." The words landed like a second blow. He straightened in his chair. "What did you say?" The director, startled by his intensity, repeated it. "The orphanage. It carries your daughter's name, as you requested. It is the institution you have funded since her passing. Little Sophia, the girl who danced with you tonight, she has lived there for nearly 3 years." For a moment, Victor could not speak. His mind reeled, struggling to connect the threads. The child who had called him Papa, who had looked into his grief with unflinching innocence, was from the very place he had built in memory of Anya. A place he had chosen to support, not out of love but out of guilt, as though pouring rubles into an institution could balance the scales of fate. He had never visited, never allowed himself to walk its halls or hear the voices of the children. He had kept it at a distance, a line item in his empire of philanthropy. And yet destiny, or something far beyond his comprehension, had carried one of those children straight into his arms. The revelation stole the air from his lungs. He rose abruptly, startling the director, and demanded more information. Sophia's full name, her story, how she had arrived at the orphanage, and as the details spilled forth, her parents lost in a tragic fire, her early years marked by instability, her resilience shining through despite it all, Victor felt as though invisible hands were weaving threads between their lives, binding him to her in a pattern he could no longer ignore. He left the gala without a word to the remaining guests, stepping out into the icy Moscow night. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, settling on the shoulders of his black overcoat. He walked through the city streets with no destination, his mind ablaze. Could it be coincidence? Or was it something more, something Anya herself had orchestrated from beyond? He did not believe in miracles, or at least he had not for a very long time. But tonight, he felt the fragile stirrings of faith returning to him, carried on the voice of a child who had unknowingly cracked open his heart. The city glimmered around him, neon lights reflecting in the snow, cars hissing along wet pavement. He passed families walking together, children bundled in scarves clutching their parents' hands. Each sight stabbed him with longing, but also with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. For years, he had recoiled from such images, unable to bear them. But now, for reasons he could not explain, he lingered on them, letting them seep into the emptiness within him. When he finally returned home, his mansion loomed like a mausoleum, silent and vast. He stepped into the grand hall and was greeted by nothing but echoes. Yet as he climbed the stairs to his study, he caught himself pausing, as if expecting a small voice to call out from the shadows, "Papa, one more story." The silence answered back, as it always had. But this time the silence was not absolute. It carried with it the faintest echo of Sophia's voice, reminding him that the word was not lost forever. That night, Victor did not sleep. He sat by the fire, staring at the photograph of Anya that hung above the mantel. She smiled back at him, frozen in time, her eyes alight with mischief and innocence. "Did you send her to me?" he whispered into the quiet. "Was this your doing?" The fire cracked, But of course there was no reply. And yet, for the first time in years, Victor felt as though he was not entirely alone in his house. In the days that followed, he could not banish Sophia from his thoughts. During meetings, her voice intruded. During meals, her eyes haunted him. During sleepless nights, the word Papa replayed in his mind, no longer as a dagger but as a lifeline. He tried to resist it, tried to bury himself in the machinery of his empire, but resistance proved futile. Something had shifted permanently. At last, unable to bear the pull any longer, Victor ordered his car to the orphanage. For the first time since its founding, he would step inside. The journey through the city was quiet, the hum of the engine punctuated only by his shallow breaths. As the car approached the gates, his chest tightened. He had built this place in Anya's memory, but had never dared to see it. Now the moment had come. Inside, the halls were simple, but bright. Children's drawings lined the walls, bursts of color against pale plaster. The sound of laughter echoed faintly down the corridor, and Victor froze at the sound. It was not Anya's laughter, but it was laughter nonetheless. Pure, unfiltered, defiant against despair. He followed the sound until he reached a room where children played with worn toys and handmade puzzles, and there, among them, was Sophia. He spotted him instantly. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed unsure whether to run to him. Then, with a courage that had already become familiar, she crossed the room and stood before him. "You came," she said simply. Victor knelt, something he had not done for anyone in years, and met her gaze at eye level. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Yes, Sophia, I came." The director of the orphanage watched from the doorway, astonished. The staff whispered among themselves. None of them had ever seen Victor Petrov this way, unguarded, vulnerable, human. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was that a grieving father and a lonely child had found one another in the unlikeliest of circumstances, their lives stitched together by loss, by longing, and perhaps by something greater. And so began a connection that would test Victor in ways he had never imagined. For now it was enough that he had returned to the place he had avoided, faced the shadows he had fled, and discovered that destiny was not always cruel. Sometimes it gave back, imperfectly, unexpectedly, but with a strange, undeniable grace. Victor woke that morning with a sensation he hadn't felt in years. The heaviness in his chest was still there, as it always had been, but alongside it came something new, a restless anticipation he could not quite name. For the first time since his daughter's death, he did not rush to his office, did not answer calls from board members, did not open reports. Instead, he summoned his driver and gave only one instruction: take him to the orphanage. During the drive, Moscow unfurled before his eyes with an unfamiliar rhythm. The snow-covered streets, the hurried figures of people wrapped in heavy coats, the glittering displays of luxury shops, all the familiar landmarks of his daily life, seemed insignificant now. What mattered lay ahead, inside a modest building that cruelly or perhaps mercifully bore the name of his lost daughter. When he walked through the gates, the staff were stunned. None of them had ever seen Victor Petrov in person. The billionaire who sustained the institution financially had always been a distant, abstract presence, represented only by checks and official letters. Now he stood before them, wrapped in his heavy overcoat, carrying an expression that revealed more questions than certainties. Children rushed through the corridors, some too young to grasp who he was, others recognizing vaguely the name on the plaques. But one child did not hesitate. Sophia ran to him, her face glowing with a smile that seemed to light up the entire entrance hall. "You came back," she said, as if she had never doubted it for a moment. Victor's heart quivered. He could not recall the last time anyone had waited for him with such certainty. Not shareholders, not employees, not business partners. To be awaited, sincerely awaited, was a privilege of family. He swallowed the tightness in his throat and answered simply, "Yes, I came back." The little girl took his hand as though it belonged to her and pulled him eagerly down the corridor. She showed him the drawings taped to the walls, the improvised toys, the simple dormitory where she shared space with other girls. Victor observed everything silently, a strange mix of pain and tenderness gnawing at him. It was impossible not to imagine how Anya might have lived such moments had she survived, surrounded by peers, sketching colorful pictures, inventing stories, laughing without fear of tomorrow. The pattern repeated in the days that followed. Victor began visiting the orphanage regularly. Sometimes he brought books, sometimes nothing but his presence. He read aloud to Sophia and the other children, his deep voice stumbling over words but still coaxing laughter. Other times, he simply sat in the courtyard watching Sophia play, run, fall, and rise again, as if the world were simple. and in every detail he discovered a spark of life he had believed forever extinguished. Yet fear shadowed him like a constant companion. At night, in the cavernous silence of his empty bedroom, he asked himself whether he was making a mistake. Attachment meant risking loss again. Attachment meant reopening wounds and inviting pain. His heart wanted closeness, but his mind screamed warnings. He was skilled at managing contracts, mergers, and market wars, but he was utterly defenseless before the kind of vulnerability this child awakened. One afternoon, Sophia ran to him with a drawing clutched in her hand. It showed a tall figure holding hands with a smaller one, both smiling beneath a yellow sun. "That's you and me," she announced proudly. Victor took the paper, his hand trembling. He nodded, unable to say the words that threatened to break through, but it made him happy, happier than anything else in his life. That night, alone in his study, he pinned the drawing to the wall. It hung there among priceless works of art, yet to him it was the most valuable piece in his entire collection. The days stretched into weeks. Victor's life rearranged itself around these visits. Business became background noise. The orphanage became his center. The staff noticed how Sophia blossomed. Once quiet and withdrawn, she now spoke more, laughed more, even slept better. The bond between them was undeniable, like two broken halves finding a way to fit again. And then life, with its merciless hand, twisted the story. Sophia began coughing. At first it was dismissed as winter air, but the cough lingered, deepening. Soon she developed a fever that refused to subside. The call came one evening, urgent, trembling, and Victor dropped everything, racing back to the orphanage. He found her lying on a small bed, her face pale, her eyes dulled by exhaustion. Yet when she saw him, she still smiled. "I'm not afraid, Papa," she whispered, the words spilling out naturally now. No hesitation, no correction. Victor's throat closed. He wanted to believe her, but fear consumed him. Not again, he thought, not this time. The doctor present explained that it was a serious infection. She needed immediate hospitalization. Victor did not wait for procedure or permission. He lifted her into his arms and carried her himself, commanding the car to speed through the snowy streets. Inside the car, with sirens wailing in the distance and the city lights blurring past, Victor's panic grew unbearable. He held her fragile hand and was assaulted by memories of Anya, the helplessness, the moment he could not protect her. Tears welled, but he fought them, not wanting Sophia to see. She turned her head weakly toward him. "You won't leave me, will you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He nearly broke. His instincts screamed to promise her the world, to swear he would never let go. But the shadow of past failure strangled his words. Instead, he squeezed her hand firmly and said the only thing he could, "I'm here." At the hospital, chaos unfolded. Nurses hurried, doctors examined her, machines beeped. Victor, who had always commanded rooms with his authority, discovered his power was meaningless here. No check, no connection, no empire could guarantee her safety. All he could do was wait. Waiting became torture. He sat at her bedside, staring at her chest rising and falling with effort. Each cough, each strained breath stabbed him like a blade. People whispered in the hallways. Staff recognized him, astonished to see the infamous billionaire bent low beside a child's bed, his hands clutching hers as though his life depended on it. They whispered, but he did not care. All that mattered was Sophia. Nights dragged into eternity. Victor did not sleep, did not eat. He remained there, whispering to her, holding her hand through fevers and restless dreams. Sometimes she called him Papa in delirium, the word tumbling again and again from her lips, and each time it shattered him, yet it also bound him more tightly to her. No longer a memory of loss, the word had become a vow. Between visits from doctors, Victor tried to act, to control something, offering resources, summoning specialists, demanding the best care. But medicine was no empire. It yielded to no command. He was reduced to a man stripped of everything but hope. In that rawness, something surprising happened. He prayed, not formally, not as he had as a child, but in desperate whispers to Anya. "Help her, please. Give me one more chance to protect someone. Let me repair what life destroyed." Days blurred together. Sometimes Sophia seemed to improve, only to relapse by nightfall. Victor's heart swung violently between hope and despair. Yet through this agony, something essential crystallized within him, the realization that true love always carried risk. To avoid loss was to avoid living. To shield himself from pain had been to live half a life. Watching Sophia fight for breath, he understood that he could not deny what she had become to him. She was not simply a child he had sponsored. She was his daughter of the heart. and he would fight for her with everything he had left. And so Victor Petrov, billionaire of steel and shadow, found himself undone in the simplest, rawest way, at the bedside of a sick child, praying for her life, realizing that if she left, he would finally and completely break. The hospital room had grown into a world of its own. The sterile white walls, the humming machines, the faint beeping of monitors, it all became the rhythm of Victor's life. He sat beside Sophia's bed, his large hand wrapped around hers, unwilling to let go even for a moment. Outside, the city moved with its usual pulse, traffic, snow, noise. But inside that room, time was suspended. Everything hung on the fragile rise and fall, the girl's chest. One night, when the fever had not broken for hours, Sophia stirred faintly. Her eyelids fluttered, and with effort, she turned her head toward him. Her lips moved, barely forming sound, and he leaned close, desperate to catch the words. "Don't leave me, Papa," she whispered. Her voice cracked and weak, but steady enough to pierce him straight through. The sound shattered what little defenses he still had. For a moment he could not breathe. It was the same word, the same name Anya had once called him, but now it came as a plea, a tether pulling him toward a decision he had been too afraid to make. He could not hide behind his wealth, behind his coldness, behind his grief. In that moment he understood with absolute clarity. Love was not a memory he could bury. Love was here, asking him to stay. Tears slid down his face as he bent over her hand. "I won't leave you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Not now, not ever. Do you hear me? I am here, Sophia. I will always be here." He kissed her small fingers, feeling their frailty, and vowed silently that if fate allowed her to live, he would never again waste the gift of being a father. The following hours were agony. Doctors moved in and out, medicines were administered, and Victor watched, helpless, praying to a heaven he had long abandoned. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to shift. Sophia's fever eased. Her breathing steadied. The coughing, though still present, grew weaker. The doctors exchanged cautious glances that carried a flicker of optimism. Victor did not dare hope at first. He had been betrayed by hope before. But when dawn broke, and Sophia opened her eyes with a clarity that had been absent for days, his heart erupted. She smiled faintly at him, her lips dry and cracked, but the expression was unmistakable. "Papa," he murmured again, but this time not as a plea, this time as recognition. He pressed his forehead to hers, overwhelmed, tears flowing freely. "You are safe," he whispered. "You are safe, my little one." The staff observed quietly, moved by the sight of a man known across Russia as unshakable, reduced to sobs of gratitude over a child's recovery. They understood, as Victor did, that something irrevocable had changed. Over the next weeks, Victor remained by her side as she grew stronger. He brought her flowers, read her stories, and even clumsily learned how to braid her hair when she asked. Nurses whispered that they had never seen such devotion. Sophia laughed again, weak at first, then with growing strength, and each sound seemed to rebuild Victor's heart, piece by piece. But gratitude was not enough. Victor knew that when she left the hospital, he could not return her to a dormitory bed, to nights without family, to mornings without someone to call her own. He would not lose her, not to illness, not to circumstance, not to indifference. And so one morning, he walked into the director's office at the orphanage and said in a tone that brooked no argument, "I want to adopt her. Sophia is my daughter now." The director stared at him, stunned. "Mr. Petrov, adoption procedures are complex. There will be investigations, legal steps, approvals. Then begin them," Victor interrupted. "I will comply with everything, but hear me clearly. She will not be abandoned again. She is mine, and I am hers." And so the process began. It was long and filled with paperwork, interviews, and officials skeptical of the billionaire's intentions. But Victor faced every obstacle with a patience no one thought him capable of. He answered every question, opened every door of his life to scrutiny, because for the first time in years he had something worth fighting for. During this time, he and Sophia built a rhythm of their own. They visited the park when she was strong enough, fed pigeons by the frozen fountain, shared ice cream though the air was biting cold. He told her stories of his childhood, of how he once dreamed of being a pilot, and she told him about the stars she imagined her parents lived among. At night, he tucked her into bed in the guest room of his home, still technically temporary, but filled already with her laughter and her drawings taped to the walls. Every small ritual, every simple moment deepened the bond between them. Victor no longer lived as a man waiting to die. He lived as a father, determined to give his daughter not just wealth, but love, protection, and a name spoken without fear. At last, After months of scrutiny and legal hurdles, the day arrived. Papers were signed, seals stamped, and Sofia Petrov became official. When Victor knelt to embrace her afterward, he threw her arms around his neck and whispered, "I told you, Papa. You didn't leave." And he held her close, realizing she was right. He had not left. He had chosen to stay, to fight, to risk pain for love. And in that choice, he had found not only a daughter, but the return of his own soul. The following year arrived with a quiet inevitability. Winter had returned to Moscow, draping the city in its endless white, and with it came the annual charity gala, the same one where Victor's story had fractured and been remade. Invitations glittered with embossed letters, chandeliers were polished, gowns and tuxedos prepared. Yet this year, one table in the grand ballroom no longer stood empty. At its center sat Victor Petrov, but he was not alone. By his side was Sofia, no longer just a girl from the orphanage, no longer fragile and uncertain. She was his daughter now, legally and wholly, dressed in a gown of soft blue satin, chosen not for its cost, but because it made her smile. Her hair was braided neatly, adorned with a small silver ribbon that Victor himself had clumsily tied, insisting he learn the simple rituals of fatherhood. As they entered the ballroom together, the crowd fell into hushed awe. Whispers spread like wildfire. The man once infamous for his solitude now carried the warmth of family beside him. The orchestra began, and once again Victor rose to dance. But this time, there was no hesitation, no fear of what the word Papa might awaken. He held Sofia proudly, guiding her across the floor as the violins soared. And as they moved together, his eyes filled with tears, not of grief, but of gratitude so vast it nearly consumed him. He had thought he would never hear laughter in his house again, never feel a child's hand gripping his for safety, never be called Papa without pain. Yet here he was, living it. Around them, guests whispered still, but the tone had changed. Where once they had mocked or pitied, now they seemed to understand something profound unfolding before their eyes. Some even applauded softly as Sofia twirled under Victor's hand, her face radiant with joy. To her, this was not a performance, not a spectacle. It was simply a dance with her father. When the music ended, Victor knelt, ignoring the gasps from the crowd, and embraced her tightly. "You saved me," he whispered into her ear. She giggled, not fully grasping the weight of his words, and replied, "No, Papa, we saved each other." Later that evening, Victor stood apart for a moment, watching Sofia laugh with other children, her smile wide and unguarded. His gaze drifted upward, to the golden chandeliers, and then beyond, as though he could see past marble and glass into the heavens themselves. He thought of Anya, of her laughter, her questions, her small hand tugging at his sleeve. For years he had asked why she had been taken, why he had been left behind. Now he felt he knew. He had not abandoned him. He had guided him, step by step, to this moment, to Sofia, to a love that did not replace but healed, a love that did not erase but rebuilt. The realization washed over him with the quiet certainty of truth. Love was not measured by possession or permanence. Love was the courage to open one's heart again, to risk loss, to choose life over silence. Anya's memory would never fade, but it would live now not only in grief, but in the laughter of a sister she had never met yet, had somehow delivered to him. As the gala continued around him, Victor allowed himself to smile fully, unashamed, for the first time in years. The tears that glistened on his cheeks were not of sorrow, but of a man finally at peace. And so the story of Victor Petrov did not end in loneliness. It did not end in silence. It ended in the embrace of a child who called him Papa, and in the rebirth of a man who had thought himself beyond saving. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story of love, redemption, and the extraordinary ways fate surprises us. Leave a comment below. Share what moved you most, or tell us about someone who brought healing into your life when you least expected it. And if you believe someone else needs to hear this message of hope, share this video with them. Your voice, your presence, makes this community stronger. Together, we keep these stories alive.